Philip, I want to frame this conversation the same way I did with Keith. I even did this with Helen, actually, her idealist view, Keith's illusionism, and now with you and panpsychism. But before we get into that, the question I asked them, which is what I'm about to ask you, is can you give me a philosophical history of the mind-body problem? How you conceptualize this, how you started reading about this topic, and how you got to where you are today. The reason why I asked this question is I believe it allows us to understand your views and how it's changed over the years and how you sort of came to the view you have today or the conclusion you have today. So if you had to give me that philosophical history, what would it be?
Thanks. That's a great first question. Yeah, I mean, the mind-body problem has been wrestled with for centuries, and I think it arises because there are two things we know about in very different ways. There's the physical world around us that we know through our senses and which we learn more about through scientific investigation. But there's also the world of our own experiences, our thoughts, our feelings, which we know about in a quite different way, I think. I can't look inside your head and see your feelings and experiences. Each of us knows about our own experiences just through being directly aware of them. If you're in pain, you're just directly aware of your own feeling of pain. So there are these two things that we think are real, namely the physical world we know through the senses, and our own minds we know through our immediate awareness of our own conscious experience. And the challenge is, how do these fit together? How do these seemingly very different things fit into a single unified theory of reality? I mean, standardly nowadays, people call it the hard problem of consciousness, think of it as the mystery of how do brains make consciousness. I mean, that's one way into it. I suppose I think maybe that way of setting it up might limit our options somewhat. But I think more generally, that's the question. How does consciousness and the physical world fit together? And it's a problem I've been obsessed with as long as I can remember, really, because all of the available options seem to have such deep challenges associated with them. So I sometimes say it's a little bit like Churchill famously said about democracy. It's the worst theory of government apart from all the others. So I sometimes think that's what it's like trying to find a solution to the mind-body problem. You're sort of trying to find the least worst option. But that's the core of it, I think.
So if you had to look back at the philosophers, the scientists perhaps, who influenced your views the most leading up to this point, who stands out for you? Who were those people who actively changed the way you perceived this problem?
I think Descartes has to be a huge influence. Going back to studying Descartes at high school, Mr. Foley was my philosophy teacher. I didn't do that well, actually. I always keep meaning to go back and visit him one day. But I mean, what I think Descartes got dead right is that the mind is better known than the body and the external world. This is what we find in the first two meditations. Descartes' famous work is set up as 6 meditations where the narrator is sort of philosophizing to himself or herself. I suppose himself if it's Descartes. And the method is to try and doubt everything that we can doubt, to see where we end up, to see what, if anything, can't be doubted. And the narrator, namely Descartes, concludes that the body, the brain, the physical world, all these things might not exist for all we know for sure. But the one thing we can't doubt is the reality of one's own conscious mind. So, I mean, again, just to come to a vivid case of if you're in pain, you can't really doubt the reality of your agony because you're sort of directly in touch with it in a way that makes its reality totally evident to you. So I think Descartes was right about that. After those meditations, it goes a bit sketchy, sort of where he tries to prove the existence of God and then prove the existence of everything else on that basis. It goes a bit awry there, I think. But I mean, in more recent times, the philosopher David Chalmers was a huge influence on me. You know, when I studied philosophy, we were taught the two traditional options: dualism, Descartes' view that the mind is separate from the body or the brain. At the other extreme, materialism, the view that all that really exists is the physical world, bodies, brains, physical processes in the brain. And I came to find deep problem both of those traditional options, but we were just taught that's what you've got to choose from, like it or lump it. And I got really disillusioned, and I actually left my first degree just wanting to stop thinking about consciousness, thinking there was no resolution. That's actually what I argued for in my end of degree dissertation. But I later discovered the writings of David Chalmers, who really brought back to life, I guess, something like the Cartesian project. Also, Thomas Nagel, his famous paper, What's It Like to Be a Bat, where he argues that no matter how much we learn about the neurophysiology of a bat, we'll never fully understand what it's like to be a bat, what it's like to adopt a bat's perspective. Galen Strawson, actually, so I wasn't taught these things as an undergraduate, and then when I started my MA, finally at the university, there was a professor who thought all the same things I did, who adopted this crazy view known as Panpsychism that I adopt. And so this was Galen Strawson, and he was a real confidence booster. I hadn't met another professional philosopher who thought anything like the kind of views I was attracted to in the philosophy of mind. So he, from personal interaction, he was a very important influence. And later also David Chalmers has been an important mentor as I got to know him personally. And finally, someone who has a very opposed view to me, David Papineau, who is a physicalist with a total opposite view to me, but was very kind in guiding me and helping me argue against him, and understand his view and argue against him, and was really a model for, I think, really set me a model for how intellectual interaction should happen through civilized, respectful disagreement. So there's probably more than I can mention, but that's a handful of the influences, I think.
I mean, you mentioned so many great names there, legends in the field. But something that captures my attention is exactly what you concluded with, is that having this discourse and disagreement actually helps us move forward. And I think you and Keith are doing that wonderfully at the moment. I mean, Mind Chat, the fact that you guys are such esoterically different views, opposingly different opposites in a sense. I mean, to Keith, consciousness, phenomenal consciousness is an illusion. Whereas for you, consciousness is the fundamental basis of reality. So let's go through panpsychism. Let's run through this. Give me your definition of panpsychism, how you see it, how you interpret it, and how it's different perhaps from other views of panpsychists out there who are perhaps popular in the field.
Brilliant. I mean, just to say on your last point, I've just always loved to engage with people with radically different views to me. Just try and get into their mind and think, how are they thinking these crazy sounding things? And I really do think that's a really productive thing to do, and something me and Keith have aspired to. Don't always achieve it. Sometimes we get a bit annoyed with each other, but yes. But turning to panpsychism, so I mean, in our standard way of thinking about things, consciousness only exists in the brains of highly evolved organisms, and so only exists in a tiny part of the universe, and only in very recent history, at least in terms of the cosmic history of the universe. But for the panpsychist, consciousness pervades the physical universe and is a fundamental feature of it. Contemporary panpsychists don't necessarily think that literally everything is conscious, despite the meaning of the word. Pan means everything, psyche, mind. So the word literally means everything has mind. But contemporary panpsychists tend to think that the basic building blocks of reality perhaps fundamental particles like electrons and quarks, or perhaps universe-wide fields. Many theoretical physicists tend to think that fields rather than particles are the things that make up reality. But whichever way you go on that, these basic constituents of the physical universe have very rudimentary forms of subjective experience. So not the very rich, complicated experience that you and I have, not just you and I, other human beings, other animals, which is the result of millions of years of evolution. At this very so the idea would be that that's what evolution does with consciousness, molds very simple forms over millions of years into much more complex forms that you or I enjoy. But the thought was, in the beginning, as it were, all there were these very rudimentary forms of experience at the level of fundamental physics, and everything else is kind of built up from there.
So in essence, you're saying that, let's say, quarks, bosons, well, the most fundamental particles that exist have experience, in a sense. It's got some sort of an experiential aspect to it, not necessarily a thinking, cognitively engaging sort of experience, but an experience nonetheless. This comes down to some sort of a qualitative phenomenon.
Absolutely. So yeah, it's hard because people automatically think of something like human experience, so they think of the electron feeling existential angst or wondering if it's Tuesday or something. But you know, think about, I mean, as a way into this, I often like to go down the spectrum of life from very complicated organisms as we move to simpler forms of life, mice, bed bugs. If bed bugs have experience, it's presumably much more simple than we can conceive of. And as we move to simpler and simpler forms of life, we find simpler and simpler forms of experience. For the panpsychist, this just continues right down to the basic building blocks of the physical universe. But you said that an aspect of it is experiential, and I'm not sure how you intended that exactly, but that can almost suggest a sort of dualism, like the particles have physical properties like mass and charge, and also these invisible consciousness properties. But that's not actually the view as it's standardly defended these days. The view is rather that all there really is at the fundamental level of reality is forms of consciousness, and what we think of as particles or fields or physical properties like mass, spin, and charge are just ways of describing these fundamental forms of consciousness. So it's a radically non-dualistic picture of reality. It's not mind on the one hand, matter on the other. In some sense, all there is mind. And what we call matter is just a way of describing these fundamental forms of consciousness.
I definitely did not intend for it to have that dualistic aspect. But so in essence, what you're actually saying is that the charge, the movement of the particle, these are the things it's doing. It's not what it is. That's the basic difference here. These are merely the way in which it's behaving, but it doesn't explain what it actually is.
Yes, and this is the reason panpsychism, after being laughed at for so long insofar as it was thought about at all, I think for a long time there was maybe just this guy Timothy Sprigg in Edinburgh who defended panpsychism. Just early in my undergraduate career, I went to a conference they had just after he died to remember him. That was one of my first conferences. But it's recently again come to attention, largely through the rediscovery of really important work by Bertrand Russell from the 1930s, and very much as you said there, Tevin, Russell's starting point observation was that for all its virtues and wonders, physics is confined to telling us about what stuff does. Physics tells you what an electron does, what a quark does, it gives us detailed equations to predict how fields are going to evolve over time. And that's really useful information and allows us to manipulate the world in extraordinary ways and build incredible technology. But as a, as a philosopher interested in the ultimate nature of reality, you might want to know, okay, that's interesting, very interesting, what an electron does, but I'm also curious about what an electron is. And about that, physics, as it were, isn't really interested. It's just interested in the behavior. So there's a kind of hole in our scientific story of reality there. And then Russell's observation is, well, we're looking for a place for consciousness, this mind-body problem we started with. How the hell do we fit consciousness into our scientific story? We've got this big hole. Maybe we can stick consciousness in the hole. So I sometimes put it by saying, on this view, matter is what consciousness does. So there's just very simple forms of consciousness interacting in simple, predictable ways. And what physics does is give us equations to describe how that stuff behaves. So in this way, physics emerges from underlying facts about consciousness. So typically, people try and do it the other way around. They start with physics or physical science, more generally neuroscience, and try and work out how you get consciousness out of that. I think that's impossible, incoherent even, for reasons we could perhaps discuss. But actually, it turns out to be pretty easy to do it the other way around. To start with some facts about very simple forms of consciousness and get physics out of that. And that's very easy because physics is just purely mathematical. So as long as you've got, it's just about, patterns really. So as long as you've got some kind of stuff, whatever it is, interacting in the right way to get the right patterns, you've got physics.
Yeah. And I think something we often don't, well, most physicalists don't comprehend and think about more than they should, is that we even speak about the fact that physics claims that 95% of the universe is inexplicable. It's something we don't know anything about. So physics is so thoroughly incomplete that it's like almost a clue that you should not be a physicalist, because we in essence understand almost nothing about the universe.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. I mean, well, one thing I guess it could go a few different ways. If you're talking about dark matter, I suppose that's distinct, as I understand it, at least, from the matter that makes up our bodies and brains. So someone like Sean Carroll, who I've argued with a great deal, thinks, oh yeah, physics is far from complete. But in terms of the matter in our bodies and brains, in normal terrestrial conditions, so not in very high energy or the kind of high gravity when you're about to step into a black hole, he thinks, in those conditions, it's very well understood. And he uses this as an argument against the kind of view I adopt, where consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality. But there are two problems with that. I mean, one is that although we do have some kind of consensus about physics at those energy levels, the kind of experiments we use to support our theories in that region, as Sean Carroll agrees, are all conducted with very small numbers of particles. For example, in particle colliders, we just have no idea, I would argue, whether the equations would look exactly the same in incredibly complex systems like living brains, one of the most, with 85 billion neurons. We've never done any experiments to test that. I think it's a kind of zeitgeist of the moment that people assume some kind of very reductionist story. But given that our physics is based on experiments with small numbers of particles, I think we really, just based on the experiments, ought to be quite agnostic about that. But of course, the more fundamental reason is, okay, even if Sean Carroll were right, for example, that we do understand the physics of the matter in our bodies and brains, that's only telling us what matter does, not what it is. So even in that case, there's still the option of the panpsychist hypothesis. Of course, you'd have to look at what are the reasons for accepting that hypothesis. But I I don't think really what we currently know about the scientific world, the physical world, scientifically casts any doubt on that story.
Yes. I mean, when people talk about panpsychism, a lot of people sort of say it as if it's some spiritual claim because it was often associated with spirituality. A lot of people who meditate, for example, people perhaps in Eastern traditions, they've made this claim before many years ago. So for thousands of years, many people have been saying, I mean, this entire universe is conscious. If someone has an LSD trip or an acid trip, they start to see things in a way as if the universe is sort of palpating or has a heartbeat or sort of some sort of a living system. So this has always been part of the conversation. But yet when people talk about panpsychism, a lot of physicalists, reductionists have this, they look down upon these people as if they have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. What do you think they most misinterpret about this?
In terms of the connection to spirituality, I always say two things. Firstly, that there is no necessary connection with panpsychism and anything spiritual. Many of the contemporary proponents, like Angela Mendelevici or Luke Roelofs, or indeed David Chalmers, who's sympathetic to panpsychism, these people are the most, atheistic, secular, reductionist, but they reject the coherence of a materialist account of consciousness, and they think consciousness obviously exists. So they don't believe in any sort of transcendent realm. They just believe in pain and seeing red and think, look, we need an explanation of that. In many ways, I think there's perhaps a division in the panpsychist contemporary community between people who are more secular and people who are more open to spiritual ideas. A little bit like maybe you had in the psychoanalytic community between Freud and Jung. Jung was very open to spiritual convictions, whereas Freud was like, this is supposed to be science, get all this mumbo jumbo out of my face. But anyway, so firstly, there's no necessary connection. But if for independent reasons, perhaps as you say, on the basis of mystical experiences, maybe up through meditation or maybe through psychedelics or whatever, you independently have certain spiritual convictions, then probably a panpsychist worldview would be more consonant with those convictions. So, if you have the kind of mystical experience you just described, where that it seems to you that reality is filled with consciousness, well, if you're a panpsychist, you already think that. And so, whereas if you're a materialist and you just think at the basic level of reality, it's just what you get from physics, then it looks like you have to think the mystical experience of that kind is a sort of delusion of some kind. Yeah. You don't have to think that. Of course, it's a further deep philosophical question. Even so, whether it is rational to trust mystical experiences. I mean, on that score, I am somewhat persuaded by the argument of William James in his chapter on mystical experiences in his great book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. Most of this is a psychological study of mystical experiences just as a psychological kind. But at the end, he says, would it be rational for someone having that kind of experience to trust it? And he says, well, look, if we say it's okay to trust our ordinary empirical experiences, there's a table in front of me, but it's not okay to trust the mystic, to trust her apparent mystical experiences, then there seems to be a double standard there. Yes, a mystical experience could be a delusion, could be just something funny in the brain. But our ordinary empirical experiences could be a delusion. We could be in the matrix, right? This could be a long dream, as Descartes made vivid to us. So, I think all knowledge is rooted in trusting experience, trusting how things seem to be. And I don't see why you can say, what the argument would be that it's okay to trust empirical experiences, but not okay to trust mystical experiences. What's the relevant difference?
Yes.
I don't think anyone's ever answered that.
Yeah, I mean, even when you take into account, I mean, certain physicalists, someone like, let's say, Anil Seth. I mean, the way he describes reality as a controlled hallucination, and yet in a dream, it's sort of an uncontrolled hallucination. So in a sense, when we're awake, our hallucinations are more attuned to the reality. So although I am hallucinating this experience, the fact that I do pick up the pen and it does feel like I'm picking up the pen means it's a little bit more control. But that doesn't change the fact that I'm hallucinating in essence. The fundamental nature hasn't changed, whether I'm asleep or awake. They're both still a hallucination. So in what you're saying, it makes so much sense, because the truth is, whether it's mystical, whether it's some sort of a thought, or whether it's reality, they're both still inexplicably different. They're the same.
Yeah, I mean, Anil Seth's work is really, really interesting. We've debated a lot of times. We're due to debate again in November at the Royal Institute of Philosophy annual debate. And I'm always saying to him, I totally agree with all your scientific work. You know, but I think the scientific work on consciousness just leaves open all the philosophical positions. You could be a nihilist materialist, but you could have a dualist version of Anil, a panpsychist version of Anil. We've got to distinguish the philosophical aspects of the problem from the scientific aspects. Some people think, science is proving materialism, but no, materialism is a philosophical hypothesis, as is panpsychism, as in dualism, and we need to assess all these on philosophical grounds. But actually, I've digressed slightly. Coming back to your point, which was an excellent one, I think. Yeah, I mean, some philosophers get a little bit not annoyed by the word hallucination there. It sort of seems to suggest that the external world is not real in some sense. But if it just means that our experiences are in our own minds, in our heads, they don't put us in direct contact with the world around us. We can't get outside of our own consciousness to see if it corresponds to reality. So what do? All you have direct contact with is your own conscious experience right now. You don't even know whether you existed a few seconds ago. You can only do that by trusting your memory, which is itself another kind of seeming, another kind of experience. Of course we can, then people say, well, we can check our memories, we can check our senses, we can get precise with science, but only once you decide to trust them in the first place. If I don't decide to just trust without any reason my senses or my memory, I can't get out of the present moment. I can't do any science. So although in a sense we can verify our senses, what our senses are telling us, that's only in a kind of circular way once we've already trusted them. So it seems to pretty much the same with a mystical experience. You can't totally rule out it's a delusion, but it's the same in the case of sensory experiences. And if anything, people who have mystical experiences claim that it seems more real than their ordinary experiences. So
I think I once heard you mention the fact that when someone claims to have some sort of experience in whatever way they have it, what makes that any less true than anything that they've experienced otherwise? Like in the normal realm, I mean, you speak about this quite often. I feel that when I first started out reading about consciousness, when I first entered the field from med school, when I thought about it, I mean, I always wanted to study this. I was materialistic all the way through. I even wrote an essay in my dissertation. Keith read it. He gave me comments. But I defended illusionism as a theory of consciousness using psychiatry. I'm sorry.
I'm going now. I'm really joking.
But prior to that, I had the emergentism view of consciousness. Then I somehow slipped into illusionism. Sorry, had the flu last week. I'm slowly recovering.
Oh no!
And for everyone who's watching, and every time you see Philip looking down, it's because his screen's at the bottom. So don't that he's just looking at me basically.
You give him my secrets away, but
Just
yeah.
giving them some context in case they're wondering, is he reading something? What's going on? Um,
Well, I was turning my emails off actually that bleeped at one point. Anyway,
but anyway, so yeah, as I was saying, when I started out as someone who believed in emergentism. I mean, slowly you work your way up. Then I went into illusionism. And from starting this podcast and listening to people's coherent, logical arguments, philosophical arguments, I mean, you, I don't know anymore. I have absolutely no idea what I'm so agnostic at this point that to me, if anyone approaches me with some sort of a cogent, coherent argument, I'm willing to listen all the way. And I think that a lot of scientists, per se, because of scientism, just look down on certain views like panpsychism, idealism. In fact, we should talk about those two and how they're different or similar because they both somehow talk about the consciousness as being fundamental. But I think that link, as we spoke about earlier, between spirituality and panpsychism is exactly why scientists or scientism hinders listening to this philosophical argument. Do you agree with that?
I do very much. I mean, I think we're going through a strange period of history where people are understandably totally blown away by the success of physical science and the wonderful technology it's produced. And that has such a visceral effect on you. You think, oh my God, we can put someone on the moon, we can have these tiny mechanisms that, just such incredible technology. But it doesn't follow from that experiments and observation is the only way of finding out about reality. Clearly, experiments and observation are a very important, very successful way of finding out about reality, but their success does not entail that there are not other ways. And the least controversial way of finding out about reality, independently of observation and experiments, is the reality of your own feelings and experiences. If you strictly follow the kind of methodology of Daniel Dennett or my good friend Keith Frankish, and you only believe in what can be established on the basis of observation experiment, then you are led to disbelief in your own feelings and experiences, or at least you're not allowed to believe in anything known on the basis of introspection that doesn't also come from external observation, right? So Keith often says, I believe in consciousness, I believe in feelings and experiences. But when you dig into that, he totally agrees with Dennett. And Dennett says the data for a science of consciousness are what he calls heterophenomenology, which is explicitly restricted to what you can know from the outside, including reports, right? When you say something about your consciousness, but then it isn't taking that as testimony about an inner realm of your inner life. He's just taking the report as a physical act that we need to explain in terms of brain mechanisms or whatever. So the only things Dennett believes in and Keith believes in are what can be established from third person public observation experiment. Why? I've never, my hours and hours and hours of talking to Keith, why can't I? Yes, of course, experiments and observation are very important, but what about my immediate awareness of my pain? Why isn't that another fundamental way of knowing about reality? So I think, someone like Keith is at least consistent. I think I'm consistent, but I think most people are in this confused middle way where they think, of course, my consciousness exists, but they don't follow through and realize in that case, there's a fundamental data point here over and above experiments and observations. So you can't just say we can only find out about reality through observation and experiments, because no, there's something else we need to plug in here. And so that's the least controversial example, but I think there are other examples like our experience of value, our experience of that human trafficking is abhorrent. We think there's something objectively bad about this. And you could say, well, that's just our subjective reaction. Well, it doesn't seem to be. Why, if it's okay, I mean, that's just like saying, oh, my experience of the table might be a hallucination. I might be in the matrix. I might be, but it's rational to trust my experience of the table. And it seems to me similarly rational to trust my deepest moral experiences. So I think there are many different ways of knowing about reality. And the task of the philosopher, which we've kind of forgotten about in recent times, in my view, is to put them all together. It's the job of synthesis. Take what we know from science, what we know from our careful ethical thinking, what we know about mathematical reality, excuse me, the world of numbers and logic that necessary structure reality mathematicians and logicians tell us about, what we know about our own conscious experience, and synthesize it all together in a single unified theory of reality. So that, that's what I'm most passionate about, is moving us on from this scientism where we think, no, it's just, you just got to, all we can really believe in is what we know from experiments, and everything else has to be squeezed into that. And if it can't be, it doesn't exist. Because that leads to this really impoverished picture of reality where really our official worldview doesn't allow for the reality of consciousness, doesn't allow for the reality of moral facts about good and bad and human dignity. And I think that's a weird, unhealthy, difficult way to live. I mean, if it was the truth, it'd be the truth and we'd have to get used to it. But once we see that there is no good reason, philosophically speaking, not to take seriously these other ways of knowing about reality, because all knowledge, including scientific knowledge, is just rooted in trusting experience, then I think we can come to a more expansive conception of the world we live in, and one that's a little bit better for our mental and spiritual well-being, I think.
I mean, you painted...
That was a bit long-winded.
No, it's fine. The more long-winded, the better. I think the listeners, they want to hear your views. I mean, this is all about, I mean, it's your episode. This is about you. But along the lines of what you were talking about, Dennett, how would you respond to something like this? Because Dennett once said something about idealism and panpsychism in a way, describing them sort of as a modern day version of the Ian Vittel. I mean, we're always looking for something deeper. We always want that little extra thing that makes us a little more special somehow. And for humans, from it being life, being at the center of the universe at some point, Copernicus ruins that. Then Darwin takes us off the top of the food chain, and now all we have left is consciousness. So we're going to find whatever way we can to make this the most important thing. What do you think about that? How do you respond to something like that?
Well, it's an ad hominem argument, isn't it? Yes. Which means it's not engaging with the argument. It's speculating, psychoanalyzing about the motivations of the person defending it. I think we're used to we're very culturally used to the idea that this people who have religious or spiritual ideas, it's because they can't face the reality of science or something, that they need to believe in something. But actually, for my own case, I mean, I think I'm more subject to the motivations that lie behind the Dennett picture, which are very seductive as well. It's very seductive to have this simple picture that, experiments are giving us the truth, like the kind of Ricky Gervais story. Listen to Ricky Gervais. I think Ricky Gervais, it's very important to his identity and his sense of who he is and his sense of security, that I think he needs to believe in this very simple story. The experiments give us the answers and we're on the right side of it. And these superstitious fools, they're on. And I think that you can psychoanalyze people's motivations in that way. And I mean, I feel often very silly defending the views I do, because in the kind of, culture that I grew up in and that I hang around in, these things are don't fit in. And so, if I need to be, I need to constantly analyze why I'm thinking what I'm thinking, and I'm constantly critiquing my arguments. But I actually think I need to be more on guard about the seductions of scientism than the seductions of some need to believe I'm special or something. Look, at the end of the day, one can only speak for oneself. That I'm sure I do have motivations, but in lots of ways. But fundamentally, I've always just really wanted to know what's true. That's just been my drive. I want to know the answers here, and I've changed my mind a lot. I constantly am sort of talking to myself in my head, trying to find the best argument, because I want to know, is this right? Is this I just want to know the truth. So, and then if Dennett says he doesn't believe me, then what can you do? But at the end of the day, we should just engage with the arguments and and try and see what they need.
Heterophenomenology, as you say. Keith calls it quasi-phenomenal experiences. So there's sort of implicit that it's implicit that it's existing, but it's just not what we think it is to these thinkers. It's almost, it is there. It's just how we interpret it that's different and a bit misleading.
So that doesn't sound too radical, does it? When you say, "Oh, consciousness is just different to how we think of it." What you've got to know about Keith and Dennett's position, he's probably going to be listening. He might listen to this, but is just come back to this point, the heterophenomenology idea that the only data for a science of consciousness are what you can know from the outside, right? That is the only things we can take seriously. So again, that includes what people say, but it's not what they say, because then you can. I think most people, when they trust what someone says, that they're in pain, they're taking that as testimony and evidence about what can't be seen. Like, I can't see your pain, but you tell me about it, and I thereby indirectly know. But that's not how Keith sees it, right? He sees the report. Yes. The physical act of your mouth moving as the datum.
It is the third-person objective quantitative experience,
that's everything. That's all that exists, right?
First-person subjective qualitative experience, which to you is the fundamental experience, and to Keith is the complete opposite.
Yeah, there's both, isn't it? There's of course, I agree with Keith that we. Of course, who would deny that we do know a lot from the outside, and that's part of the data. But I've never seen a good argument from Keith about why I can't just take it as a starting point. My feeling of, and Dennett's noticed. Dennett's got fascinating arguments about how introspection can lead us astray. Eric Schwitzgebel, one of my favorite philosophers, who's a materialist, has got some great stuff on that. But okay, introspection makes some mistakes. It doesn't mean the whole story's wrong. Like, that
Eric and I
subjective qualities we seem to experience are just not real at all. So the challenge is, I think the more conventional physicalist picture you referred to earlier, the emergentist picture, that they want to try and reduce or account for. They say, "Oh yeah, we believe in subjective experience. We want to account for it in terms of the purely third-person quantitative science." I think Keith and I both agree that just doesn't make any sense. That's just incoherent. You can't even articulate these subjective private qualities like the redness of a red experience in the language of physical science. So your neuroscientific theory couldn't even articulate the data. So it's not going to be able to explain it if it can't even articulate it. So we both agree that doesn't make sense. But he thinks, well, just believe in the stuff you know about through the third person way. And if you can sort of translate your talk of consciousness into the stuff you know about in third person terms, then okay, that's fine. But you're only allowed to do that. Why? I think it's just over enthusiasm with science. But you mentioned Eric Schwitzgebel. I think I interrupted you there.
Yeah, sorry. No, Eric and I also chatted about it.
Oh, brilliant.
He is very skeptical. He's got that skeptical mindset that leads him to think of so many creative different ways that you can interpret reality and the way we live. I mean, some of his philosophy of science fiction is very intriguing, very diverse writing. And I think that only happens when you are sort of someone who can think metaphysically about things without necessarily having a religious or spiritual view on it. There was almost no dogma towards it. You're just naturally skeptical. Keith and I actually had a 3-hour conversation about illusionism. We went into the ethics of it all. It was quite a long chat. But I just spoke, I think about 3 days ago, to Helen. Yet Chappelle is, am I saying the surname correctly? But we spoke about idealism and your view, panpsychist, the panpsychist and the idealist view sort of overlap in certain ways to some people, and to some people they believe it's completely different. How would you differentiate between these two views? I mean, there's a lot of new people out there. Bernardo Castro, there's Donald Hoffman with conscious realism slash idealism in a sense, because he is taking consciousness to be fundamental. How do you differentiate your views?
Good. Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, to start off with, obviously, I mean, I think of all of these views as very much on the same side of the debate and close in all sorts of ways. It's just wonderful that from both science and philosophy, people are really exploring these ideas that start off with consciousness and build up on that basis, instead of starting off with matter and getting to consciousness, starting off with consciousness itself.
Yes.
So, it's great all these views are on the table. People define terms in different ways. The way I tend to think about it is that the panpsychist, although they think consciousness is fundamental, they also think the physical world is fundamental, but without being dualist, because how do you square that circle? Well, the physical world is just somehow made up of consciousness or infused with consciousness. Whereas the idealist, I think, tends to think there's something more fundamental than the physical world. Either the physical world is some kind of illusion, or there's some deeper reality underlying the physical world. So I think Bernardo and Donald Hoffman fit into that camp. It's a little bit difficult with Helen, actually. She's but her view is inspired by George Berkeley,
Yes.
the great 18th century idealist, who thought that the physical world is real, but it's not fundamental. Tables and chairs and mountains and so on are constructions out of ideas. At the fundamental level of reality, we've just got kind of immaterial minds, and the physical world is constructed out of ideas in those minds.
And she sort of eliminates God from that picture. So to her, it's the ideal, the Berkeleyan idealism without God.
Yeah. So then God was central to Berkeley's picture, because it's a question, well, what happens to a table when we're not looking at it?
Yeah.
And Berkeley's idea is, well, God's looking at it. Yeah. And then Helen's idea, building on that, was, well, why does this cosmic mind, or whatever it is, have to have all the attributes of God? Why does it have to be all powerful? Why does it even have to be a sort of thinking agent in order to sort of experience the table when no one's looking at it? So she instead thinks of it as a sort of tapestry of experience, lots of threads of experience. So, but the problem in terms of distinguishing her view from panpsychism is, I think she wants to, does she want to identify that tapestry with the physical world?
Yeah.
And then I'm not clear how it does.
Helen is idealist in the way she thinks. She's just defending a sort of idea within idealism without actively calling herself an idealist.
Right. Yeah. That's a good point. But why that view that she explores should count as idealism rather than panpsychism, I'm not totally sure, actually. But because
after having such a long conversation, I'm still not entirely sure.
Yeah, because it's not it doesn't fit the more standard understanding of idealism, where there's something underlying the physical world. And And that's, I mean, that's the argument I have with Donald Hoffman. I'm not sure the motivation. I never understand the motivation for thinking there's something deeper than the physical world.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, you can think of panpsychism as a sort of middle way between materialism and idealism.
Mm.
So there's, for the panpsychist, in some sense, there's just the physical world, particles and fields, but that's filled out with consciousness. And I don't see why we want a place for consciousness. Why can't we put it, as it were, inside the mathematical structures of physics? Why do we have to put it at a deeper level than that? I've never really understood the motivation.
Sorry, this is going to digress, but it's going to go back to something you mentioned earlier, which was, I mean, values, inherent morals, and ethics, and how these all play a role. I would like to ask, what about cultural differences? Because, I mean, if we have this objective truth about ethics and morals, I mean, we clearly see a difference in culture. I mean, and to some cultures, perhaps human trafficking might just be the way the culture has just grown up over time. And to many people, maybe they don't see it as bad. I obviously, I'm not one of those people, but how do we differentiate then? Because then we have to agree that we don't have objective morals or values. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a very important challenge to the moral objectivist position. And, I introduced this by saying, if you're going to be skeptical about moral objectivity, you need to say, well, why is it okay to trust your sensory experiences but not your moral experiences? Otherwise, there's a double standard. But actually, you've just potentially answered that question by saying, here's the difference, with our empirical experiences, we get a great commonality, but then there's this disagreement. And that's a very important challenge. It's a while since I've thought about this. Trying to remember what my view on it is. I mean, so one thing is, I think there's a lot more. I mean, I would say not so much I'm a realist about morality, but a realist about value, that there are facts about what is objectively valuable. And when you think in terms of very, very general claims about value, there is a hell of a lot of commonality and universality. For example, pleasure is good, suffering is bad. Understanding is good, ignorance is bad. Creativity is good. Apathy and banality are bad, right? Do many people disagree with those general value claims? Now, where you get disagreement is when it gets into the how it all fits together. More specific value claims about justice or the ethics of abortion or whatever. But then that's to my mind, that's to be expected, given that things just do get very complicated when the value equation gets so many different factors are at play. So you sort of expect people to evaluate them in different ways, just as you do in philosophy or any complicated topic. When there's complicated considerations and you've got to sort of do some highfalutin abstract thinking, people end up disagreeing. That's kind of to be expected. The other factor, of course, is that there's a lot of self-interest with morality and people wanting to believe certain things. And in our modern times, corporations influencing how people think and so on. And, if you don't want to believe, equality is an important part of economic equality, is an important part of justice. If you're very wealthy and you don't want to be taxed, you've got a motivation not to believe that. Of course, there's people coming out of certain religious cultures or certain traditional views. So for all these reasons, you'd expect, I think, there to be diversity. But on these very, very general sort of axioms of value, like pleasure is good, pain is bad, I think there's actually a lot of agreement, which is consistent with value realism.
So within the panpsychist view, if you take, I mean, you mentioned something like abortion. So ideally, that draws a lot of like philosophical questions with it, because in essence, this is an experiencing system, part of reality, and now we're drawing the line using scientific methods, saying, okay, 12 weeks is the cutoff line because this is what has developed since then. Um, how do we work around these things? How do we work around perhaps life after death? I mean, there's so many aspects to this what does panpsychism tell us about these things?
Wow, we're getting these
Take it.
very deep and difficult ethical questions. I mean, in a way, panpsychism might not make that much difference insofar as panpsychists tend to think at the macro level of reality, not everything is conscious. And so they might, their view is that at the level of fundamental physics, everything is conscious. But at the higher level, a panpsychist might hold the same as anyone else. It's a sort of open question. So they might not think this. They don't necessarily think the table is conscious. They think the bits it's made up of are. But I suppose panpsychists will naturally think spread consciousness. Think it's more spread throughout the biological world than other people may. And I mean, for one thing, it makes it very difficult to. When you think about the ethics of eating, I argue a lot on Twitter with vegans about, if you don't think plants are conscious, then you've got a nice moral cutoff point. So I'm just not going to eat. I'm going to eat things that aren't conscious. I'm not going to eat things that are conscious. But I think plants probably are conscious, or at least are communities of conscious entities. And so you got to eat something. It's hard to know what the moral draw off comes pretty difficult there. I mean, maybe same with a fetus. I mean, for anyone, it's very difficult to establish where exactly consciousness emerges in pregnancy. But a couple of things. I mean, I suppose for that reason, I'm more inclined to place a lot of moral weight on self-awareness, awareness of one's own existence, the capacity to understand oneself and the world around one, which, for example, pigs have more than newborn babies. So you might think, in some sense, there's greater. I'm not saying we should kill babies, but that there is. We've got to bear in mind that I think a pig is much more intellectually, cognitively sophisticated than a very early fetus. So I think those kind of things play heavily for me. I was always very influenced as well by the argument of Judith Jarvis Thompson that it's not so much necessarily denying a fetus a right to life, but thinking about the right of the pregnant woman not to be forced to have her body used to sustain that life.
Yes.
So Judith Jarvis Thompson had this wonderful analogy of, you wake up, you've been kidnapped and knocked out, and you're hooked up to a famous violinist. And it's a bizarre story, really. The musical society have hooked you up to this violinist because you're a rare donor. And unless you stay hooked up to this violinist in this hospital room for 9 months, the violinist is going to die. Now, no, everyone thinks the violinist has a right to life, but that doesn't mean you're obliged to allow your body to be used to sustain that life. So I think for those two reasons, I suppose that would be my motivation for being pro-choice. That the lack of cognitive sophistication of a very early fetus, and also the right for a woman to choose whether her body is used in that way.
Now, that's a great answer.
Very difficult, though.
Just going back to your story about the vegan argument, just today, I mean, my receptionist told me that she doesn't like vegans, but she's just joking around, and she's like, my main argument is that if you're eating all the plants, you're technically stealing all the animals' food. So, in essence, you are still killing the animals. I was like, that is quite a ridiculous but yet still quite fair. Fair enough.
One way of looking at it. I mean, the position I've come to is what I call humanitarianism, of just
Treating the animals.
not eating any animal products that are factory farmed. And
Yeah.
you know, a lot of people say, oh, you know, I don't agree with factory farming, and maybe they'll buy meat that's not factory farmed, although that can be very expensive. But very few people ask in restaurants, is the meat factory farmed? You know, don't eat chocolate unless the milk is not factory farmed. You know, dairy is often one of the worst, most cruel forms of factory farming. So, you know, if it's strange to me in some ways being vegetarian if you're happy to eat chocolate, because you know, milk chocolate and dairy products. My thought is, if more people did that, then that could really have an impact. But I'm going to read George Monbiot's new book, actually, Trying to Persuade Us All to Be Vegan for Environmental Reasons.
Okay, I think
Maybe I'll end up vegan.
Out on that. But anyway, let's not get into that. The main thing here is, tell me about some of the best counter arguments you've heard for against panpsychism. If you had to play devil's advocate on yourself right now, what has really gotten your attention where you really thought, I might not be able to argue this as well as I wish, but perhaps one day someone will?
That's a good question. I mean, probably the most discussed challenge is the so-called combination problem, which is, okay, it's all very well postulating particles having consciousness or whatever, but ultimately what we want to explain is our consciousness, and how on earth do these little conscious things come together to make our consciousness? And on the face of it, you know, it seems to be something very hard to make sense of. Is it even coherent for lots of little minds to make one big mind? And this is something I've changed my mind about a lot and thought about a lot. I think where I've ended up with, though, is I think that the challenge is really is at its strongest, at least, if you're going for a very reductionist panpsychist story, where you say really all there is conscious particles, and what I think of as my mind is just a complicated collection of conscious particles. So someone like Luke Roelofs tries to defend this very reductionist kind of panpsychism, and that is hard to make sense of. There seems to be a deep unity about my own conscious mind that resists that kind of very, very reductionist story. It's hard to deny that my mind is something over and above just a very complicated collection of particles, whether they're conscious or not. But actually, and this comes back to my dispute with Sean Carroll, I now no longer think there's much of a motivation to go for that very reductionist story. You only feel pressured to do that when you start from the conviction that everything that happens is ultimately explicable in terms of known chemistry and physics. And I used to think that. I that's kind of what I got taught as an undergraduate. But just from talking to neuroscientists, really, we've got a interdisciplinary consciousness group at my university here, and we really don't know anywhere near enough about the brain. To, you know, what we know about the brain, really, we know a lot about the basic chemistry, so like the bottom. We know a fair bit about large scale functions, what big bits do. But what we're almost clueless on is how those functions are realized at the cellular level, how it works. And we'd have to know a lot more about that before we could confidently say, you know, everything that happens in my brain is explicable in terms of currently known chemistry and physics. I think we just don't know that. So I'm more attracted to at least not such a reductionist story. You know, once you're freed from that, then you can just think that let's just stick with particles for the sake of simplicity. just have basic capacities to, in certain circumstances, combine into more complex unified forms. And we should look to neuroscience to guide us in when that happens. I'm quite attracted to the integrated information theory, which is one proposal as to when consciousness arises in the brain. So, but
I actually wanted to ask you about that at some point. Your view on integrated information theory, and how do you feel it plays a role with the sort of explaining or adopting a panpsychist view? Because obviously they're starting off with phi and moving upward. Do you feel as that represents a panpsychist attempt at philosophical thinking?
So my view is we need to distinguish not very sharply, quite sharply, the scientific bit of consciousness research and the philosophical bit. So the scientific bit is to work out what kinds of brain activity go along with what kinds of experience. That's the scientific bit. And integrated information theory is one proposal on that. It says that you get consciousness in a system when there's more phi, as you say, or integrated information in the whole system than in its parts. Mm-hmm. So probably this glass of water isn't conscious because there's probably more phi in the molecules than in the liquid as a whole. But in the brain, there's huge, in certain parts of the brain at least, there's huge, even though there's a lot of phi in a neuron, there's even more in the whole system. So that's why you get consciousness. So that's one interesting proposal. What I like about it is that it allows for kind of sharp cutoff points between systems that are conscious and systems that aren't conscious. And on philosophical grounds, I don't think it makes sense to have fuzzy boundaries around consciousness. Like, think of a cloud. There's no sharp cutoff point between where's the edge of the cloud? Which is this a little bit of water vapor outside the cloud, or is it part of the cloud? There's probably no fact of the matter there. But if we're thinking of my consciousness, either something is part of my experience or it isn't. I don't think it kind of makes sense. And for there to be fuzzy boundaries around my mind, I mean, that's something we could debate. But IIT, integrated information theory, can make sense of that. But that's just the scientific bit. And I think that, like any philosophical theory, like any scientific theory, it's neutral on all the philosophical options. So you could be a materialist proponent of integrated information theory and think just have an identity between consciousness and phi. Or you could be a dualist like David Chalmers and think phi and consciousness are different things, but there are special laws of nature that tie them together. Or you could be a panpsychist and you could think, consciousness is at the fundamental level and that bubbles up when you've got phi or something. So phi, I think I like for certain specific reasons to do with you can't have fuzzy consciousness, fuzzy boundaries in consciousness. And I suppose it fits with panpsychism in that it predicts that there's more consciousness than we ordinarily expect. But
are there any other neuroscientific theories that you sort of are attracted to?
Not really for that reason, because I mean, look, there's a lot. It's very early days. There is no consensus in neuroscience. Some people thought it would be all wrapped up by now, but it's very hard because consciousness is not publicly observable, and so where you've got a human being, you can ask them what they're experiencing, but the more distance you get from the human case, it's very speculative. Eric Schwitzgebel now thinks we will just never know whether a snail is conscious because it's just too distant from the human case. But I think we can try and look for philosophical signposts, and I think this important, what we can look for what we know about consciousness from the inside. And one thing I think we know about consciousness from the inside is that there can't be fuzzy boundaries when it comes to consciousness. And I think I'm happy to be corrected on this, but I think the integrated information theory is the only scientific proposal that can accommodate that philosophical data point. So to my mind, it's whatever its flaws are, very far from a final theory of consciousness. It's, to my mind, it's the only philosophically credible one.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on, like, let's say someone like Penrose and John Vervaeke and quantum consciousness? Where's your head at with that?
I mean, Penrose thing starts with a fascinating argument to do with Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And it's interesting, though, that that is really, when you think about it, it's not so much to do with consciousness, it's to do with cognition, it's to do with understanding, because what Penrose is thinking is he's wrestling with how to make sense of mathematical understanding given Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Gödel's incompleteness theorem seems to show, Penrose thinks, that, you know, a computer couldn't do the kind of mathematical have the mathematical understanding we have, because you can't reduce mathematics to a system of axioms where you can prove everything with those axioms. So he thinks mathematical understanding must be sort of non-computational, and that's why he thinks there must be some kind of quantum non-classical physics coming in here. So you know, that's fundamentally his motivation. I wonder whether, again, this comes back to the need to connect everything to kind of currently known physics, or closely related to currently known physics. I mean, in terms of that problem, I think I'd be much more open to supplementing macro level physics with the idea that there are just new causal dynamics that kick in complex systems. This is sometimes known as strong emergentism. So we don't have to go down to the quantum level. We can just say, look, there's new causal dynamics that emerge in human cognition. And this is actually what I talk about a lot in my new book I'm working on, that's much more about conscious understanding and conceptual meaning. When philosophers and scientists talk about consciousness, they always talk about pain and seeing red and itches and these kind of very animal sensations. But I think consciousness is permeated with meaning and understanding what things are and what they mean. Fills my experience. You know, I don't experience colors and shapes. I experience tables and chairs and faces and stuff. So I think Penrose is spot on, and he's one of the few to be wrestling with these deep mysteries about conscious understanding. But I think I would go a slightly different way with that and just say, go for strong emergentism rather than trying to hook everything up to the quantum level.
And then people like, let's say, Rupert Sheldrake, what are your thoughts on someone like his view on consciousness?
So I'm quite good friends with Rupert Sheldrake, and we're doing a debate, or a discussion rather, in the near future on religion without belief, because I guess we're both kind of practicing Christians who have very unorthodox views of what it means, what is involved in being a Christian, and then we're hooking up with oh, what's his name? My mind's gone blank. Wonderful poet and environmental activist who recently surprised everyone by converting to quite conservative Christianity. And anyway, we're going to be having a chat with him. But anyway, coming back to, yeah, so Rupert's got very interesting views. You know, I think he can defend them he can articulate them and defend them very well. But so I suppose Rupert is defending his views as a scientist on empirical grounds rather than strictly philosophical grounds. So I suppose it's kind of, this may be a bit of a cop-out, but it's sort of outside of my skill set in a way. I think, you know, knowledge is very specialized now.
Yes.
And I'm jealous of people in the 16th century when you could sort of understand the cutting edge science and the cutting edge mathematics. But, you know, in a way, when it comes to empirical questions, I sort of have to, because it's not my skill set, I sort of have to trust the the consensus, and I suppose for better or worse, the consensus is against Rupert. I suppose he would say that's for cultural reasons, and people aren't taking him seriously for cultural reasons. And I'm very much open to that argument. I've experienced in philosophy, which is my area, how ideology stops certain views being taken seriously, and so I'm open to that possibility, but because it's not my skill set, I just don't think I can assess whether he's right or not. It's absolutely fascinating views though, and I certainly, he's had his TED Talk banned and everything. I certainly don't think he should be as ostracized as he is. I think, again, there is a sort of fear there, isn't there, about, I suppose people worry about losing control, being open to any old stuff. But look, if someone can defend their views with rigor and seriousness, then they should be given a hearing. And I think,
but do you think
as far
that's
as I can
why
see,
some people are now Mysterians regarding consciousness? Because there are just that many convincing arguments, and we just don't know.
Yeah, Mysterianism is again a position we should take seriously, and I'm to some extent open to it myself. I mean, you're asking for challenges to panpsychism. I suppose another one would be, well, just the position of, shouldn't we be agnostic?
Yeah.
I can't look into an electron to see whether it's conscious or not. Maybe we should just be agnostic. Maybe we should just say, so there's a view that's very closely connected to mine that just says, so agrees with this Bertrand Russell starting point that physics doesn't tell us what matter is, only what it does, and agrees that, whatever matter is, it somehow explains consciousness. So you might say it's proto-conscious, that it somehow has a nature that makes consciousness, but it's not itself conscious. And I'm very much open to that position. The philosopher Daniel Stoljar, in his review of my academic book, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, was sort of pushing this line, that there's something right about this Bertrand Russell position, but we just don't know enough to be able to say panpsychism is the case. So I'm kind of open to that. But at the end of the day, my current thinking is, why go for mystery when there's an intelligible hypothesis as an alternative? And all we can ever do as science and philosophy, I think, is try and work out, the most simple, parsimonious hypothesis compatible with the data, if we can account for not only consciousness, but the facts of physical science and natural science more generally, by postulating basic, simple forms of consciousness, then that seems to me, by normal scientific criteria of, going for the simplest theory that can account for the data, that's the view we should go for. We don't know for sure. We'll never know for sure. And we should be open to other possibilities. But I still think panpsychism is just a bit more likely to be true than other options on the table.
I think you give a great coherent argument for it. I mean, I've read Galileo's Era, I've read Consciousness, Fundamental Reality, and that one's a lot more in depth and in detail. So like for all the people who read Galileo's Era, I think I highly recommend you go read the other one, because you go into far greater detail. And it's obviously meant for a different group of people, but if people have some sort of a view on your view of panpsychism, they should definitely read both before making a conclusion. On that note, who do you think, because obviously I would recommend your books to someone who wants to read about panpsychism, who are the people you'd recommend people should read in order to get a greater understanding of panpsychism?
Well, it's just there's so much going on at the moment. I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Because I guess a lot of academic philosophy work now can be so inaccessible. I think this is, again, it's a reflection of knowledge being so specialized, and often philosophers, I think we're trained to try and have these watertight arguments. And so you try and cover all bases, and then it ends up getting really complicated and the jargon comes in. So that's why, in a way, I wrote my academic book first. because once you write a more accessible version, you've got to be a bit looser with the argument. You can't cover all objections. So then philosophers read it and say,
Yeah.
oh, you haven't considered this, you haven't considered this. And so then I could say, well, read the academic book if you want the full story, the full argument. But yeah, so Luke Roloff's book, Combining Minds, is a wonderful book. A little bit challenging, I guess. Heta Hasselmer, a great philosopher, she's got a great piece with Nautilus that I would recommend, giving the basic panpsychist position. Something on the integrated information theory for Philosophy Now. She wrote for a special issue I edited. And she's working on a book on anti-physicalism, actually, for Keith's series in Philosophy of Mind. Keith told me about recently. And another resource people might want to look to is there was a special issue of the Journal of Consciousness Studies on 20, how many was it now? 19 essays by philosophers and scientists and theologians responding to my book, Galileo's Error. And this is going to be coming out as a book actually later this year called Is Consciousness Everywhere? So yeah, there's essays by Anil Seth and Sean Carroll and Giulio Tononi.
The usual
Christoph Koch.
suspects all coming
Yeah.
to you.
Yeah, but I mean, well, in a way, usual suspects. But I can't think another time these kinds of scientists have responded to panpsychism. So it's in a way,
I personally can't wait to read this.
It's quite there is a development. I mean, these guys don't agree with me, but I think taking the view as seriously enough to engage with it, I think is an achievement. So that's there's loads of stuff. What is, I suppose, Miri al-Bahari is a very good Australian philosopher who defends a more spiritual version of panpsychism inspired by Hindu mysticism, and partly based on arguing that we can trust the testimony of experienced meditators. She's been working on a book for a while. I hope to come out soon. My blog.
So tell me, Philip,
Lots of stuff out there.
Next book that you've got prepped and ready to go. What's the goal here? Well, what's the next mission? Because I mean, you've written the academic one, you've written Galileo's Error. What do you hope to show us next?
I hope this book actually is going to be both academic and accessible. I've wrestled for a long time about which to do. I can't.
It's a tough balance to crack.
Yeah, I'm hoping. Maybe it's not possible, but so each chapter at the moment is divided into a more accessible bit and a more technical bit, but the whole thing I try to make quite accessible. But it's a different book in content as well. But I guess the big idea is exploring the middle ground between God and atheism. So I think in the West, people think you have to fit into one of those groups. You either believe in the omni-God, all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good, or you think we're in this meaningless universe where meaning only arises at the end of evolution or whatever. And I've come to think that both of these views are pretty implausible. Both have data they can't handle. In terms of the omni-God, it's the familiar problem of evil and suffering. Why would an all-powerful loving God create a world of so much suffering in it? In terms of atheism, the meaningless universe, I think one thing I discussed there is the fine-tuning of physics, the discovery in recent decades that for life to be possible, many numbers in physics had to fall in a quite narrow range, such that it's incredibly improbable that would happen just by chance. I think on the face of it, if you just look at it dispassionately, that is very strong evidence for some kind of goal-directed activity, some kind of directedness towards life in the very early universe. And I basically think as a culture, we're in denial about this. I think it's reminiscent of the 16th century, where there was this growing evidence for the Earth not being in the center of the universe. That didn't fit with the picture that people had got used to. And people couldn't accept it, and they tried to think of these ways of avoiding it. They postulated these epicycles. So they thought everything went around the Earth, the sun and the planets and the stars. They postulated these extra little orbits of the planets in addition to their orbits around the Earth, and that didn't do it. So they postulated these orbits around orbits, and we think, oh God, they were so stupid, they couldn't just accept the evidence, and we're so enlightened now. But I think every generation has got used to a picture of how things are supposed to be, and you get laughed at if you don't fit into that. And I think, I think it's just culturally impossible for people to take this evidence at face value, which is that I think what we might call cosmic teleology. So I think there's strong evidence for cosmic teleology, for some kind of directedness towards life, but also strong evidence against the omnigod. And so I'm exploring positions in between.
So Philip, sorry to cut you off there, but within this cosmic teleology, where do you think it's headed then after humans and life? Do you think artificial intelligence is sort of the next step, and then we're going to move forward from there? What do you think is happening?
God knows. Nobody knows. So look, as I say, I think there is very strong evidence, and it could change tomorrow, but science as we have it now is very strong evidence for a sort of directedness towards life. Maybe that's the end of it. Maybe this is the end of the cosmic purpose, as it were. But in a way, you might think that's kind of improbable to think that, we're the culmination of this cosmic story. So you might, we might speculate that it's still unfolding. Some kind of greater reality is yet to come. But that would be somewhat speculative. I always like a hero of mine, growing up, the heretical Catholic priest Teilhard de Chardin, who had this, he was, early days after Darwin, and parts of the church were sort of worried about what to do with Darwin, but he was inspired by the idea of evolution and the idea of an evolving cosmos. And, he thought there was these great leaps of life and sentience and self-consciousness. And he thought the next stage would be humans getting more informationally connected up, and this bringing about a new form of life and consciousness that he called the noosphere. So some people think, if you look at the way we're all connected up with the internet and WhatsApp and stuff, maybe he was onto something, but
I mean, he could have.
Who knows?
I think that still might be possible. We don't even know.
But I think it's a good life to live in hope that there is some point to it all, and that what we do contributes in some way to some greater purpose. I find doing that helps me keep my ego in check, that I'm not just thinking of my success. I'm just thinking I'm just contributing in some way to some greater purpose. And maybe there isn't a greater purpose, and but we'll never know. And I think it's a good way to live in hope of that. I think it's a happiness conducive form of life. So
would you describe your religious, or if you had to pick one, would it be more of a deistic God rather than theistic, sort of a omniscient, omnipotent, interactive God? Would yours be more deistic? You started off, let the cosmic teleology just roll, and whatever happens, happens.
So we need some kind of explanation of why the source of cosmic teleology, why things aren't better. We need a plausible hypothesis that can explain the directness towards life, but can explain why things aren't better, why this source of cosmic teleology is not more evident. So look, I explore a variety of options. One is just teleological laws that Thomas Nagel explored in his 2012 book, Mind and Cosmos. So this isn't a kind of mind, it's just impersonal laws of nature that with sort of purposes built into them. Another is some kind of something closer to the the traditional God as a sort of mind, but a non-standard designer, maybe of limited power. So maybe they really care. Maybe they're trying to do stuff, but maybe maybe all they could do was kick things off, or maybe they've got limited powers of intervention. Or maybe it's the simulation hypothesis. Maybe they're just some, scientist in the next universe up, trying out a simulation to see what comes of it. That would be a cosmic teleology hypothesis, one more naturalistically inclined people tend to like. Or cosmopsychism is the other one I consider, that if we already think the universe is a kind of mind because of our panpsychist views, then it starts to be less mysterious that there might be some kind of limited goal-directedness in it. So I'm open to all those possibilities. In terms of my religious practice, I think for me, it's more about bringing the community together, marking the seasons and the big moments of life, giving my kids a moral example, connecting individuals in the community up to something greater, and inspiring moral action in the community, things like that. And so I think all these things all these matters are very uncertain, but you've got to live your life. And I think people are when it comes to religion, a lot of people are too focused on, is it true, is it not true? And I think I personally think, for some people at least, a religiously engaged life with the community and a spiritual practice and is a wonderful way to live your life. And if it turns out all to be nonsense, I still think you've gained much in terms of a rich life, and lost little, really. It's rather than sort of some people have no interest in religion, and I'm not interested to persuade them. But I suspect there are many liberal-minded people who would get a lot out of it, but think it's kind of Richard Dawkins has told them it's stupid, or well, how do we know it's true? And whereas I think engaging with community and tradition can be a wonderful thing, and people can
actually, he mentioned he's a fan of your work, is Raymond Tallis. And something I like that he said, when we spoke, he actually told me, now that I realize he asked me a couple of questions to ask you, and I forgot to take them down before this interview. But then again, we were meant to do it tomorrow, so I was planning on doing that. But nevertheless, he's a big fan of your work, and he finds it very fascinating. And something he said that I really liked was he's ontologically agnostic about everything, but there are certain epistemologies that you can tell are just really just incorrect. But when you're talking about religion, when you're talking about life, all of this, you have to be ontologically agnostic. We don't have the answers. That's just the bottom line. And I think that's a really cool statement to make.
Yeah, absolutely. And my wife's texted me. I think I'm going to have to attend to some family matters in the not too distant future. But just to throw that in. But I totally agree with that. I think a lot of people on both, we're used, again, it's coming back to, we're used to the epistemic vices of the religious. We're used to the idea that religious people might be clinging to certainties. But I think that's very present for a lot of people on the scientific side as well. I think Daniel Dennett, he needs to believe this stuff for it. He needs to believe it's obvious, and it's, for a sense of identity. And I think,
so like Ricky Gervais, he has to sort of have this easy picture that's painted. I mean, I think
just this kind of uncertainty is unsettling to a lot of people, I think. I just, you'll never know. You've got one life, and you have your best guess.
Agnostic. I think that's the best way to put it.
Or you can have your best guess, and it doesn't have to be I'm certain, or it's a load of nonsense. I mean, I've never had a mystical experience, but I have what I would describe as spiritual experiences, often with morning or evening light. or watching my kids play or something, a sense that there's a way things are supposed to be, or there's a greater reality at the root of things. And most people think you've either got to think, oh yeah, that's definitely right, or you've got to think, no, that's nonsense. But our middle way is to sort of engage with that, take it seriously, work with it in your spiritual practice, and you'll never know one way or the other, but you can maybe live a richer life through engaging tentatively those experiences.
Beautiful, Philip. You're already touching on that, but like concluding, this is obviously called mind-body solution. I mean, you're already touching on it, but how would you say we should move forward in order to get one step closer to that mind-body solution?
We're a long way from the final answer. Humans always think they're at the end of history, and we're kind of there. We just need to, dot a few I's and cross a few T's. So I think that needs to be the starting point. What I'm most passionate about, and we're going from what we don't know. Here's one thing I feel most confident about, is that consciousness is not just another scientific problem. And the reason it's not another scientific problem is that we're not dealing with some public observation and experiments. We're not dealing, it's a very different kind of data. We're dealing with something that's privately known and trying to explain this privately known reality. Science is used to dealing with things you can't observe. But we postulate things you can't observe to explain what you can observe. In all other cases, the task of science is explaining the data of experiments or observation. This is a totally different explanatory project. We're not trying to do that. We're trying to explain this privately known reality. So we're not even at first base. We've got to get onto that. This isn't just another scientific problem. It's a philosophical problem. It's how we bring together what we know about scientifically and what we know about privately, trying to meld them together. And, so we're still debating Anil Seth, and he's saying, oh, what are the predictions of panpsychism? What does, what scientific experiments result? But that's not at first base, because that's seeing it as just a scientific problem, and it's not just a scientific problem. Panpsychism might be wrong. There are lots of good challenges, but treat it as a philosophical problem, not a scientific problem. So we've got to understand the nature, the philosophical underpinnings. We've gone from in the latter half of the 20th century, people pretended consciousness didn't exist to avoid the problem. Since the 1990s, we take the problem seriously. But too many people still think, just do more neuroscience and we'll solve it. We need to see the philosophical underpinnings of the problem. We need to see that it's fundamentally a task of how we bring these things together as philosophers, ultimately, scientifically informed philosophers. Once we get there, I think we'll be at least on the first stage. And I think just that first stage actually will in itself necessitate a kind of revolution in how we think about science, how we think about the way we know about the world around us. So yeah, exciting times ahead.
I think that's a beautiful way to end, Philip. Thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Tevin. It's been lovely finally speaking with you. I hope we get to chat.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to it. Hopefully after your book comes out, we can have another chat. But I really appreciate your time. I mean, and please just continue doing the work you're doing, because as I said, the more diverse the views, the philosophical arguments, as we spoke about, not neuroscience, but philosophy, the more diverse and the more people like you come out and speak about it, the more we can engage in this topic. And this podcast would not exist without people like you. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you very much. We'll see you again.